Lessons in Excellence, presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with ILNFS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings.
Think about this, even the rule of 3 faces stumbling blocks, but with sensible maneuvers, rescue can be at hand.
They are the losers. In the rule of 3, they are called the ditch dwellers. They are caught in the middle with nowhere to go. Their market share is often in single digits. Their profit margins are low. They burn at both ends.
We have found a company between 5 and 10% market share tends to be a ditch dweller. They have the least financial performance, least market cap, etc., especially in an industry that is well organized. Which basically says that these companies have neither the scale advantage nor a differentiation or uniqueness advantage.
Indian companies are specially vulnerable. 2 forces are combining to keep them perilously close to the ditch. 1. The Indian market is innately small in comparison to global markets. 2. The domestic economy has been prized open through the 90s, hurling Indian companies in direct competition with vastly stronger global competitors.
Most of the banks are below performance because none of them is scale oriented except let's say State Bank of India or Bank of
Or an ICICI Bank.
One of those are few, but we have hundreds of little banks like that. That's clearly one. We are finding the same thing in OEM supply function, suppliers to automobile industry. So there's just no scale here. And I think software is the same way. I'm absolutely worrying that our software companies, while we think they are very large in a global context, they are really not that big.
The writing seems to be on the wall for Indian companies. Go out to conquer global markets or become a specialist at home, or worse, fall into the ditch. But the global ambition of Indian companies has been patchy.
We've talked about the Aditya Birla Group companies.
Right.
A lot of them are commodity players.
Correct.
What do commodity players do? In fact, this whole rule of 3, where does it sit with commodities, where really there is no signifying or differentiating brand?
Right.
The consumer isn't quite so sensitive to brand.
Right, correct.
How does it play?
Yeah, it plays even more aggressively because you have no real differentiation of any kind, and therefore all it matters is scale and cost structure by and large. In commodity business, the biggest cost structure is cost of procurement.
Right.
So you have to make sure you know how to manage the procurement part properly by and large, whether you are growing your own materials, creating or buying in the marketplace by and large. You have to manage that very, very carefully. Is the one lesson we are finding out. Other thing is that you have to scale up much faster than you think. You think you may be profitable at a given scale, but if you look at the total global market, your scale may be too small. Out of nowhere, we are finding surprisingly largest enterprises emerging are no longer Japan or Korea for that matter, like Samsung's, but Chinese companies.
Just because they
have a scale domestically.
So therefore, for Indian commodity players, whether it's steel, whether it's aluminium, whether it's coal, chemicals, you are saying, again, go out aggressive. We've seen the Aditya Birla Group companies go out and do that.
Right.
They've acquired capacities in aluminium in other parts of the world, in other. We've also seen someone like the Ispat Group.
Exactly.
Go out and take big position in steel.
Right.
So again, you're saying the inevitable mantra is either become super specialists, or go out and globalize your capacity.
Exactly.
Yes. Otherwise, you're pretty much stuck. What about, come to bank, what about people like State Bank of India? Hasn't developed any significant global ambition. ICICI,
good point,
trying to capture aggressively market share within the country, hasn't yet given evidence of trying to become a significant global player.
Right.
Is trying to go out, is trying to launch banks in Europe and America.
SBI is slightly unique for two reasons. It's a state enterprise in many ways. It has branches in quite a few countries, as you know. There are branches in even China, for example, and of course in US.
Branches, yes,
just
exactly. They haven't built up business.
And the reason is that so far offshore competition aggressively in India has not come in. Multinational banks are still very small relatively, but as we see the financial sector getting more and more liberalized, as the Indian currency becomes convertible, as it's inevitable, it's going to happen, it's a matter of time, and given that situation, SBI is well positioned to become really a global player by and large. Only way they will be able to do it is not by opening more branches, but making a significant acquisition. We have to behave like what Europeans have done with the US market. Have you seen European banks come out and buy out, whether it's a Deutsche Bank, for example, or whether, you know, any of the British banks? They've really come out and made aggressive acquisitions in the US in anticipation of this, you know, WTO, globalization, etc., etc.
We're not seeing that yet. Neither ICICI Bank is also going out and is today focusing very largely on the overseas Indian space.
Correct.
But you're saying go out and capture mainstream market share.
That's the only way you can become global.
Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with ILNFS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings. Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with ILNFS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings.
I'm still a bit unclear, and therefore need a straight articulation from you. Do you think the rule of three is inevitable? I've got a sort of multiple choice question before you. Do you think it's inevitable? A. B. Inevitable only in some markets. C. It's more than likely, but doesn't always happen. And D. Is it inevitable but over a period of time? What is your position?
It's D.
It's inevitable,
but over a period of time.
And that time, is it sort of something you can calculate?
And it's basically based upon four external factors that does not allow the rule of three to emerge. One is,
it's based on the negatives.
Okay. Basically, which does not allow the market forces, competitive forces, to come into play. The first one has to do where you have in fact a regulated economy, which is exactly what India, China, you know, European, Soviet Union bloc are going through pretty much. Second one is more fascinating. Owner-managed businesses, industries such as professional services, law firms, accounting firms, etc., generally tend to have a partnership approach to doing things.
Right.
And they are very reluctant not to diversify, the divest ownership by and large. In ad agencies, this happens, as you know, on a global basis.
Right.
Advertising agencies gave up their private ownership. They formed groups like WPP, Omnicom. They're all publicly traded companies, and now we see the global rule of three in ad agency really happening.
Is coming, yes.
We think same thing is going to happen in professional services as they begin to divest ownership from management more and more. So when that happens more and more, it becomes the rule of three again.
So once you're saying competitive conditions in the market germinate, and they mature, then you're saying it is inevitable. You can't give a period of time because you don't know how quickly these conditions can be allowed to germinate. Some of them are regulatory.
Exactly.
Okay. Now where does, Raj, the rule of three fail? Clearly, you've yourself identified the reasons and areas where the rule of three doesn't work, and for various reasons.
So where does it not work?
Where does it not work?
Well, exactly as Jack said, in those situations where there is a regulatory control, where they are exclusive, where patent protection and so forth is extremely high, where others are simply not permitted to enter, where you do have major barriers to trade and ownership of assets by foreign companies, and where you also have a high degree of vertical integration, where companies tend to own their own suppliers, that they need to make their own inputs, and they also do their own retail side.
Okay, let me pick up two of these. One is patents and the other is vertical integration.
Yes.
Now patents all over the world, while the regime itself seems to be strengthening, the fact is that things go off patent. There is now a greater force towards all over the world having a uniform patent regime.
Right.
You may have patents in place for 15 years, 20 years. India has now just moved to 20 years from several grades of patents. Is there when things go off patent, then obviously the push towards the rule of three happens?
Yes, but it doesn't have to wait for that. The interesting thing about that is that the industries like pharmaceuticals and others, where that was a big issue in the past, that prevented, that led to the monopolistic kind of competition, where today now you can get around patents very easily, or you can come up with your own way of doing things, learning from that but not violating that patent.
That's the point I was trying to make, even in these two, that this is no longer appearing to be as much of a stumbling block.
It is not.
It is not. Even vertical integration. Aren't we in a situation where increasingly companies are finding it extremely difficult to hold on to that whole chain?
It is simply not efficient, and therefore outsourcing those activities and giving it to somebody else who specializes in that, for whom it is a front burner activity as opposed to a back burner for you, becomes much more a wise thing to do. So what we find, all the exceptions that we have listed, each one of them is going away.
It's going away. That's the point I was trying to make.
All
licensed economies, there are not too many licensed economies in the world, or at least they are deregulating.
That's right.
Patents is loosening. Vertical integration, the markets are not permitting. Barriers to trade and foreign ownership of assets, those are going. So it really is coming down to only where regulatory conditions are not significantly developed.
That's right, and the governments really need to be very pragmatic about this and very market driven, and to say it does not mean you step away and be completely hands off and laissez-faire, because that is going to lead to too much consolidation, may lead to rule of one, rule of two. So governments actually need to be very proactive in terms of stepping in to say what is the right level at which this market needs to have a balance between efficiency on the one hand and competitive rivalry on the other hand. And again, as we've said, we believe that with three large companies, that's what ends up being the right balance.
Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with IL&FS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings. Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with IL&FS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings. The rule of three always prevails over time, but for exceptional situations. So what are these exceptional situations? Well, wherever competitive market conditions break down, where a regulatory framework allows natural monopolies to develop, where patents and trademarks lead to the creation of exclusive rights, where government licenses control free entry and exit into industry. Quite simply, in every situation where some outside force, usually the government, stops competitive market forces from operating freely.
Let's look at some of the regulatory initiatives of the Government of India.
Right.
We've had the TRAI.
Right.
We've had the Insurance Regulatory Development Authority.
Right.
We have been talking about an oil prices regulator, hasn't really come in.
Correct.
The electricity regulator is there in a sense, but then there are several regulators at the state level.
Right.
New industries like broadcasting really don't have a regulator.
Correct.
So what has been the track record of the Government of India? It's very, very different in almost every industry.
Actually, you are right from that viewpoint. It's like whether the glass is half full or half empty.
Yes.
If you go back and have a flashback of the 70s and the 80s of this country, and look at the amount of change since 1991-92.
Anything gains by comparison to the 70s and 80s.
That's true. So I totally agree from that viewpoint. I think the journey still is a long journey for this country, and that's my biggest worry.
Have we done it right? Because all over the world this regulation, deregulation has taken place.
Yeah. No, you are right. We have
Could we not have just looked at the successful examples and just done it?
The problem is that they try to get a consensus in a diverse country, democracy, parliamentary system is as messy in India as it is in America. I'll give you an example. We wrote a document called Telecom 2000 in 1985 about the future of telecommunication industry as a document on which the blueprint was created for completely reshaping, creating a super agency that will be regulating cable on the one hand, broadcast for example, wireless as well as telco, internet, everything, right? Whatever has to be regulated. It took us 11 years going through the democratic process. You have every stakeholder objecting the whole thing because they think they will get impacted one way or the other.
So we are fine?
I mean, no, we are not fine. No, I don't know. In fact, don't give that connotation. No, my biggest worry is that 21st century will belong to twin powers of Asia. China will be definitely the largest single economy by 2020, no matter how you analyze it.
Is that right?
Bigger than the US? Bigger than the US and will become a major economic threat to the US. And whoever is a super economic power always becomes a super military power.
That's right.
India is the next
2020, only 17 years from now, China will be the largest economy?
Sooner than that, latest is 2020.
My God.
A colleague of mine and I are writing a book about obviously comparing these twin powers emerging. Every century seems to have created, if you go back to 1800s, after the Industrial Revolution, 1900s, two powers emerged as economic powers, by and large. India has the opportunity. And the biggest concern we have is that if you look at the distancing that China is making,
it's accelerating.
Accelerating.
In fact, there are studies which seem to suggest that by 2010, if China grows the way they are growing and we grow the way we are growing, China will be about 10 times. And by 2020, China may be about 40 or 50 times the Indian economy if the current growth rates are maintained.
Right. And therefore, we have to create a sense of urgency here. Urgency at the grassroots level through public opinion by saying, India, we have to change. We have to change. The future is so bright for us, and let's take charge of our own future rather than, in fact, simply being a status quo in some fashion.
And Raj, as we've seen, or at least that's the point of convergence that we've had over these several discussions that we've had, that it is boiling down to government regulation. If they do that right, industries and markets respond.
Yes, the government has to have a much more visionary approach. I mean, they've done certain things. The divestment out of the public sector has to happen faster. The government talks about reducing the ownership stake in public banks, for example, but still retaining their essential governmental character.
And voting rights. I mean, I probably I wouldn't blame you if you don't know the detail. That any shareholder in a government bank, no matter what his shareholding, private shareholder, his voting is capped. He can't, so his voting rights.
So I mean, this is, you can't have it both ways. You can either trust the market with a reasonable amount of regulation, or you try to run what has already been discredited everywhere in the world, which is a planned economy. And so therefore the government really needs to take this thing to its logical conclusion and overcome the barriers. I know that the very real barriers to privatizing state enterprises and to removing some of the regulations.
And to bringing regulatory...
And having consistency across industries, not just within industries.
All right, let me end this journey that we started, and it's been a fascinating journey. But let me end by understanding the phenomenon of a Samsung from you, Jack. Here is a company, a nowhere company, till just a few years ago.
Right.
And today it is there in a significant way as a brand in multiple product lines across the world.
Right.
How does it come into the rule of 3, 4, 5, whatever?
It has done a great job. Samsung is nothing new. This is the story of Sony. This is the story of Japanese companies, the same way Toyota, for example. And the strategy was very simple. In the case of Korean companies, they had a huge market access to America across the businesses. It's not the Korea market, which is too small actually, but they had access to a global economy essentially because of the political military alignment of South Korea by and large, which is why South Korea is so different than North Korea. Right? Interesting. Now, Samsung began to rise primarily in terms of its backward integration into semiconductors, making memory chips. It dominates the DRM chips bar in the world. They got access to the American market by and large in the process. Then they began to diversify into activities.
But they never went into too much of M&A.
They did not go into
M&A. An out story, which again seems to suggest an exception.
It is an exception in that regard, pretty much, but remember, they had access to one large market. So they could become almost a global player using the American market and dominating into DRM, as I mentioned to you. Samsung has done not well across all of its businesses, by the way.
Correct.
In consumer goods, they have done remarkably well in some countries and not in other countries. The success stories is in semiconductors, and the other success story they really have is in cell phone business. They're already now number 3. They just surpassed Siemens.
Right.
And we think Samsung will become number 2, and eventually Samsung has
challenge Nokia?
Will challenge the Nokia.
Will challenge Nokia, and this is essentially through the fact that in CDMA and other technologies it's doing very well.
Exactly. Precisely.
Raj, your take on the Samsung phenomenon, and then we wrap?
Yeah, I look at today's Korea as yesterday's Japan,
Right.
and I look at China as tomorrow's Korea.
Right.
And so the same stories are going to come out of China. And China
Is that
already
right?
has the world's largest cellular company, cellular services company. They already
Including
have-
brands? China doesn't seem to have done too much as far as brands.
That's going to happen. You know, the branding, like Taiwan, for example, right? I mean, Taiwan, made in Japan used to mean something very bad around World War II.
Right.
Gradually, they've managed to increase the image where it's become
And the
very
Sonys
high.
and the Toyotas came out as
Exactly.
brands. And now it's
Taiwan.
so China, you're saying, is going to be coming in with brands? We haven't seen that.
They're
activity.
starting to do that.
They're already
starting to
happening.
build
Is that right?
Haier as a major brand in refrigerators and appliances is becoming. China Mobile is the largest cellular telephone company already, in fact, in China. They will roll out globally. They have no choice. In fact, our forecast is that number 1 global service operator, service provider in cellular or wireless industry will be China Mobile. Will not be NTT Docomo, will not be Vodafone even.
Might
Bharti, Reliance, wake up.
Yes.
Wake up.
Yes. And the opportunity, I mean, the similar opportunities are there if the government gets out of the way and facilitates certain things. Because we've got a market as big.
Well, we've done the impossible. We've ended on a note of complete consensus. Jagdish, thank you very much for joining us on this series. Raj, thank you very much. It's been
Thank you.
fascinating
It's
and
been
very
enjoyable.
interesting.
Thank you very much.
Presented by the new 2004 Suzuki Grand Vitara XL7 in association with ILNFS Mutual Fund, more than a fund, a friend. Suzlon Energy, powering a greener tomorrow. And Indian Oil Extra Premium High Octane Petrol, extra mileage, extra savings.